Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to try and watch time quite more strictly this afternoon. In our chair sessions, I'm a stickler for time. We talked about time in economics, and this is the real world, so I think time is important. We're going to have three speakers this afternoon. But before we start those speakers, it's my honor to call on the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, to whom we owe the privilege of hosting this session, Dr. Mawala.
Thank you very much. Sanibonani. It's a way in which we greet. It basically means I see you all. So, firstly, I would like to thank Mrs. Mitamaya, a dynamic lady. She's here, obviously, who really is the brainchild of this project, and the beautiful books that have been published out of the work of Professor Mitamaya, so that his work is not forgotten. I would like to thank all of you for coming to the University of Johannesburg to celebrate and interrogate the work of Professor Mitamaya. I am the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, and I was supposed to come and join you yesterday, and I actually did come, but I went to the wrong venue. I went to Inanda Club instead of a house in Inanda. And I have been a Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg now for 5 years. For those of you who are from South Africa, you do know that I'm going to be leaving to go and become the Rector of the United Nations University. So I'm looking forward to that. Now, why would the University of Johannesburg be interested in this work? I personally have read the book that was published on Professor Mitamaya, so I do have a personal interest. But the reason why the University of Johannesburg would be interested in the work of Professor Mitamaya is because University of Johannesburg has actually positioned itself as a university that is focused on doing things, thinking things that actually matter. One of the things that we do, or that I do as a Vice Chancellor, is that every month I read a book, and I invite staff and students to come and engage me on the book that I've read. In fact, I was reading one last Friday, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So, and this is really because I firmly believe that literacy is very, very important. That literacy is shifting, and it's no longer just the ability to read and write. It's the ability to understand many other things, technology, but also to understand economics. I cannot, every time I look at an American elections and you hear candidates debating on economic issues, I cannot help but realize that unless people actually understand economic issues, economic phenomena, then they cannot fully exercise their right, their democratic right. And coming from South Africa, where the debates are quite heated, especially in the economic arena, and Samantha, you can assist me on this one. The debates are definitely very heated. I cannot help seek that our people, especially our politicians, become more economically literate. And this is the reason why we've been interested in the work of Professor Mittermeier. That yes, he deals with very complex issues, and if our politicians can understand his books, then they are not just literate; they are at an advanced level. But certainly, it is quite important. So here at the University of Johannesburg, it's a university with 50,000 students, 8,000 full-time and part-time staff members, with now, I would say, 7 campuses. I'm including the JBS Park just behind here where our business school is, and the Devland campus that we have just opened now, and also the RC Tower next to the hospital. So it's a complex university. And it's a young university in the sense that in its current form, it's just over 15 years old. So it's actually quite young. But despite all this, the university has emerged as one of the most dynamic universities in South Africa and certainly in the African continent. Just for example, if we were to look at rankings, it is now ranked second in the African continent, having overtaken, and I know Michael and others are associated with the university that we just overtook in Braamfontein. But certainly, thank you very much. Healthy competition is always good, From that perspective, we have really done well in terms of rankings. And we have invested quite a great deal in the academic project. For example, we currently have 450 postdoctoral fellows. And just a few weeks back, we have announced 200 new rounds of postdoctoral fellows that will bring the number of postdoctoral fellows at the University of Johannesburg to 650. And before it was announced that I will be moving to the United Nations, we were thinking about the 1,000 postdoctoral fellowship mark. And part of the reason is obviously because we want to infuse into our academic environment the culture of thinking, of debating, of working on complex problems in a multidisciplinary manner. So that is really why we have done this, And of course, one of the initiatives that I'm proud that I was part of forming was the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study. And Dr. Bongani Ngulunga, who is sitting at the back, for those of you who come from Europe, don't try to pronounce his name. It might not be as easy. That he heads, was one of the institutes that we built not too long ago. And if we look at the progress it has made, and when the Mittermeier Center was put to me, I knew that JAIAS would actually be the institute that will be able to drive it as far as possible. So we are quite excited that this symposium has actually happened. Now, coming to the conclusion, because I think Professor Mittermeier, I can classify him. He was many, many things. But I would say that he was a man who was interested in history and philosophy, taking economic ideas and giving them philosophical grounds. And that is very, very important, especially now that we are thinking about, with the advent of the fourth industrial revolution and almost the end of the world of work, we are now thinking about, what does it mean, universal basic income? Is it something that we should think about? And what are some of the philosophical grounding of why we should have that if the era of work is coming to an end? And how does it, how has that concept evolved over the century? Because it is not a new concept. The first person that I heard talking about universal basic income was actually Thomas Paine, who lived in the 1700s. He almost fell victim of the reign of terror during the times of Robespierre in France. So, and the weakness in our training of economists, firstly, and I will be controversial here, that we have made economics look like mathematics. It's controversial, and forgot that it is actually rooted in social sciences. And things that are rooted in social sciences, one of their characteristics is that they are very difficult to form predictive models. At best, you do scenarios, So that is basically one of my gripes with economics. The second gripe is that we have forgotten about the historical aspect of economics. If you look at our BCom degree, which is the degree where people learn economics, there is very little economic history. I say this because I was an undergraduate student in North America, and I actually did study economics, 6 economic classes. And one of the economic classes that we studied was history of economics. And the books that we were supposed to study, there were 2 sets, Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And the other one, controversial in many circles, Capital, Volume 1, by Karl Marx, And of course, Karl Marx was obviously an economist, and a historian, but also an activist. And sometimes we emphasize his activistic part more than his economic thinking, The concept of economic cycles probably was one of the first people to come up with, And of course, so that was my introduction to the history of economics. And the question that I ask, and I challenge those people who are professors of economics here, is where is history in the economics you are teaching the people? Where is history, Do we know of some of the ideas of framing economic theory that have been pursued over the period? When I was rereading, A Wealth of Nations, because last year it was one of the Vice Chancellor's reading book, so I actually went back and read it and invited staff and students to come and discuss it. I couldn't help the similarity of thinking of Adam Smith and Isaac Newton. The idea of describing grand ideas in terms of proportions. We all know about the universal theory of gravitation, that the force of attraction is directly proportional to the product of its mass and inversely proportional to, And I could see that thinking, which in many ways is reductionist in nature, throughout my reading of the book. And the second issue that I noticed was that the idea that we probably most know about Adam Smith, the concept of an invisible hand, actually is almost like a footnote. He doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it, about this invisible hand that guides economic activity and allocates resources, and ultimately concluding that is perhaps the best way of allocating resources. So the history is limited, and we need to fix that in our curriculum. The last one, which is more difficult, is the philosophy. The philosophy of history is complex, of economics is really complex. And what makes it complex, and of course if you go and read the history of economics, you will realize that in its formation as a discipline, it was not completely welcomed. I was reading a book about when during the time of Marshall and maybe even Keynes much later, that the professors at Cambridge would say, but who are these people? Are they historians? Are they mathematicians? Because obviously Marshall came up with those fancy demand and supply graphs, and points of equilibrium, completely borrowed from scientific, from physics, and as it emerged as a discipline, the philosophers did not really rush into economics as much as they rushed into other disciplines. The philosophy of science is a much more studied subject than the philosophy of economics. And how do we insert that into our curriculum so that when our people are take an economic concept, they can be able to understand it in its full and complete way. Now, coming back to South Africa, there are lots of economic issues that are being bandied around. One is called white monopoly capital. When you read about these things and you ask, what is these things? Are people actually thinking about these things? The second one is nationalization. In South African context, they say nationalization of the Reserve Bank without compensation. And of course, compensation is really a very important concept. I think Robert Shiller was once asked, summarize the whole of economics with one word. And he said, incentives. That's very powerful, that the whole of economics can be summarized with one word, incentives. Now, if you have an economic intention, that actually takes away the very basic fabric of an economy, because compensation is an incentive. What does it mean? These are very important concepts that if people are not properly trained, they are going to misuse them, and ultimately the economic systems that are going to be adopted are only going to serve one purpose, which is to impoverish all of us. So with those few words, thank you very much for coming, and I understand that you are going to have dinner, and I would like to join some of those dinners and lunches so that we can be able to talk more about these issues. I thank you very much.
Thank you for a very interesting a more than welcome talk from the Vice Chancellor, and I think I can speak for everyone in this room that we all would wish that there were more Vice Chancellors like you and your attitude to economics. Very welcome. My Vice Chancellor certainly didn't have that sort of approach. We have 3 speakers lined up this afternoon, and the first speaker is Dr. Melissa Vergara Fernandez from Rotterdam Erasmus University. I wonder if she'll be able to explain to us if she is connected at all with the Erasmus Institute for Philosophy and Economics, which was set up by Pascali Markey, and maybe she'll enlighten us about that. I'm going to try to, we run in now about 25 minutes late compared to the original timetable, so we'll probably end then, we'll try to end at least by about 4:45. Professor Fernandez has got 40 minutes, and I'm going to give her a 10-minute sign here on this piece of paper before she's talked, and then we hopefully have time for 10 minutes time for questions.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, while the beamer starts, let me thank Michael and everyone who has organized this for organizing this, and of course for the invitation to be here. I am very happy and honored, in particular because I am very hopeful that a place like the center is making space for thinking about philosophy of economics, which is a space that has sadly been disappearing from almost the entire world, and there are only a few places right now where this space to reflect about economics is available. So this is a precious space now, and I'm happy that you have managed to set it up. All right, so to answer your question, yes, I am part of the Erasmus Institute for Philosophy of Economics, and that's indeed a place that was started by Pascali Markey. Now I am doing work on in an initiative called Dynamics of Inclusive Prosperity, that it's a university-wide initiative on finance. So the work that I'm going to present you here is actually the result, well, not so far the result, because I'm certainly not ready yet or not finished yet, but it's the progress in a way that I've been doing in the last 2 years, working with a financial economist and another philosopher. This work started, or at least the interest that I have is somehow that finance hasn't really been taken up or by philosophers for sure, and by historians also very little. This has been mostly the domain of sociologists of economics, and they have done very interesting work in trying to understand finance and financial markets. But a philosophical approach is, of course, more than welcome. So that's what we've been doing in this work, and this is what I'm going to present to you today. Let me also give a little bit of introduction to the talk. That I think it's interesting that, I don't know if it's going to be something that the audience will appreciate, because especially after Alan's talk, I thought that he will probably hate what I will present. But it's an approach, or it's an attempt to, first of all, start understanding how financial economists work. And this is this maybe sounds silly, but objective approach in the sense of not trying to be normative about what they're doing, but first of all, try to understand how the discipline has evolved since its inception. Perhaps what I could say more about this is that there's something of a paradox in the way in which we look at economics. So I think we can be often very harsh with the economists that are nowadays alive, in contrast to how charitable we are to the thinkers of the past. If we would be as harsh with the past thinkers, we would often maybe just dismiss them for being wrong about what they were thinking, right? So that's kind of the approach that I would like to take, to be as charitable as possible. That doesn't mean that that I am objective. I might be biased and maybe even naive about what these people have been doing, but anyway, this is what I'll do. So yeah, that was a long preface to my talk. Let me just get started. So okay, so what I will do, or what I've been interested in is people have been talking about an empirical turn having been made in economics in the last 50, 60 years. So they have documented, several people have documented an empirical turn, which basically means that economics has become less theoretical and more empirical or applied. So one of these papers is by Hamermesh, in which he looks at 748 articles from the top 3 journals on economics, which were published in 1 year during 6 decades. So he takes 63, 73, and looks at all the articles that were published in these years. And he basically, I think you can see that the numbers themselves are not very important, but it's mostly what the trend that it's interesting here. So he shows how in 63 theory was about 50%, and how in 2011 how this was diminished to 19.1. And at the same time, empirical research having gone from, well, empirical own data from 8.7 to 34%, and in empirical borrowed data, diminishment, but still a considerable approach, a considerable extent to doing empirical work, and the same for experiments. So there is this idea that economics have become more empirical. Angrist and others also argue or suggest that the shift consists of changing research style within fields rather than across fields. And here they do a massive work with machine learning. They go through 134,000 articles from 80 journals, trying to classify what kind of research style was being followed between 1980 and 2015. And here we see some of the trends in empirical work. So the weighted fraction by empirical field, weighted in the sense of also giving importance to the journals in which these papers were published. And here we see the upward trend. And here again, we see empirical being the blue research, and the theoretical, the red one, how empirical change or gain more prominence over time. And Backhouse and Cherrier, they did some similar work, or at least try to understand what was the causes of this particular turn, and to look into more evidence. And here they don't analyze papers, but rather they try to find out about the context, and in particular, they look at the citations for John Bates Clark's medals, which they say are indicative of the way in which the discipline is moving, because this is an award that is given to economists under 40. So this might kind of show the trend of where economics is going. And they suggest that the empirical turn began somewhere in the 1970s, and they speculate, or at least they try to conjecture about the potential factors that could have caused the shift. The 3 aspects that they mention are the challenge of relevance in the 1970s, the problems that were social issues that were going on, like the Vietnam War, oil prices, etc., war in the Middle East, and so forth. The other one that they speculate about is the rise of data and computerization, and the increased importance of non-academic institutions. So this is more or less the story they tell with respect to economics in general. Now, what I'm going to do here is to try to compare this story that they tell with respect to economics in general as a trend and to compare it with what has happened in financial economics. And I think that there are both analogies and disanalogies between the general story that they give and the field of finance or financial economics. And I will be particularly emphasizing asset pricing, or at least that's kind of the field, the subfield within financial economics that I have looked at the most, but I will simply refer to it as financial economics, being perhaps a little bit unfair to people doing corporate finance and banking. And I think what I would like to suggest, and that's kind of the title of my paper, is that maybe because of this specific development of financial economics, this may give us reasons to consider it as empirically successful. And here, perhaps I would like to maybe invite, even if I'm not going to comment on this, on whether this would be an approach that would be considered acceptable for Carl Mittermeier. The experts, I would love to hear what they think about this. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just to show you what Backhaus and Cherrier say about the field, and then I'm going to tell you how this has worked in finance. So their story is a little bit, they build on some work that has been done by Morgan and Rutherford on how the discipline, the status of the discipline, say, before the war, and how after the war and between the 70s there was this idea that there was a hierarchy and theory was at the top. So theory was what people would consider to be proper economics. And important illustrations of this hierarchy that there was in the discipline was the very famous measurement without theory debate between Schelling Koopmans and Jacob Vining on the Burns and Mitchell volume on business cycles. So this is one element in which Koopman basically complains about how untheoretical their approach was, even if it was somehow also biased because they assumed that they were just measuring but not having or trying to not endorse any particular theoretical framework. They also mention, or they discuss, discussions that were taking place at the AEI over the graduate curriculum. So 98% in this discussion of the graduate curriculum, 98% of professors thought that theory was essential, whereas only 53% would think that statistics was essential, and 55% would think that economic history was essential. And there was a very clear commitment not to make economic departments convert into trading schools. And this is very telling because this is also where these trading schools, business schools, where financial economics was actually being developed. So here they suggest, after having said, okay, this is the hierarchy of theory over empirical work, they suggest that there was some kind of linear shift towards more applied work. They don't say that this was a linear shift, but they implied somehow that this is somehow how the discipline moved to doing more applied work. Now I'll tell you a little bit about financial economics in the same period. So there was indeed theoretical development in financial economics, and the papers or the models that were developed and for which people got Nobel Prizes and the pillars on which the theory still stands today was developed in this period. So here, this is the portfolio selection by Harry Markowitz, the very famous paper by Tobin in 1958, and the building of the capital asset pricing model, which was built simultaneously, or at least contributed by Sharp, Littner, and Mossin, and also Jack Traynor, but he was not part of academia. So here we can say, okay, this is analogy in the sense of theory having been very important in financial economics. At the same time, there was a lot of empirical work being done. One important aspect or one important element here was the creation of CRSP, the Center for Research in Security Prices in the 1960s, which was, in 1960, which was the first systematic collection of security prices. So this is a center established at the University of Chicago, where they decided, and this is, I'll tell you later, this was funded by Merrill Lynch. These were people who basically decided to systematically start collecting security prices that hadn't been done before. And on these prices, or on these data sets, is that the theory later was actually tested. So this is the first, or at least an important element of where the discipline is starting to form itself. There's also the work, the analysis of stock prices. So this is work that had been done by Coles, whoever the started of the Cowles Commission, Paul Kuttner, and famously, of course, Gene Fama, which basically led him to come up with the efficient market hypothesis. This is an enterprise, or this is an endeavor at the University of Chicago, in part using those CRSP data, and this was purely an empirical project. So this is the result of having looked at stock prices and having basically come up with the conclusion that stock prices are random walks, and then having modeled this particular fact, or well, facts. Now I'm scared to to say that word. Okay, and something interesting here as well is the simplification of portfolio theory for actual portfolio selection. So this is a little bit what happened is Markowitz came up with his portfolio theory in 1952. And if you were to implement that, you would have to basically compare the covariances between the stock prices of the covariances of every security possible. So it was a nice model that would allow us to decide which portfolio to choose, except that we didn't know how, we couldn't possibly do that, all the calculations that were required to do that. And then what Sharp did is to come up with a simplified way of applying this to basically the real world, so to be able to make it manageable to compare security prices. So here, these are just indications that I think make unclear, at the very least, whether there was a hierarchy of theory at the top in financial economics. What I think it's more clear from this story is, in fact, moving or going back and forth between theory development and empirical application. So there was an important attempt to test the theories and the models that were being built. And data played a very important role here. Okay, so we move now to economics after 1970. And here's again Backhaus and Cherrier. So they basically say that the privileged position of theory was challenged, and that evidence for this is the citations of Clark medalists, increasingly highlighting the significance of two ways of applying theory. One way was using this common core, theoretical core, to very specific fields and applications. So they mentioned Krugman in perfect competition and its impact on international trade, James Heckman on panel data, what that meant for all development work, and Card and Kruger, I think, also on natural experiments, mostly in labor economics. So these were specific applications of the theory to specific fields. And then the other way in which they say that theory began to be applied is basically theories were thought or were conceived as potentially being able to give us policy recommendations. So this is something that economists hadn't somehow felt in a position to do before, to say how our theories that they were developing could be applied to have some policy recommendations. And here they mention, for instance, Braceschetti on tax and education policy and social insurance. So it shows that economists believed that they were in a position to implement theories either for particular fields and particular applications and for policy relevance. Okay, so this is Backhouse and Cherrier's story. Now we go back again to financial economics at the same period. So here in the 1970s, financial economics engaged in a massive program of theory testing and confrontation with the data. So the models that were, the CAPM model and all these asset pricing models were confronted with the data that had been collected systematically by CRISP and which ended, in fact, or which led to more refinement, say, of the theory, like Fama and French, 93 and 96, where they would basically defend the idea that asset prices are determined not only by their exposure to market risk, but that there are other sources of risk that people will value and therefore determine expected returns. So, but what I think, what is more interesting, I think, about this particular aspect is that already before 1970, financial economists thought that they were in a position to be normative and have influence. So before 1970s, financial economists were already engaged in the kind of things that Cherrier and Backhouse say that only studied in economics after the 1970s. And things like the things that financial economists were engaged in is, for instance, the use of the models developed used as measure to evaluate investment performance of mutual funds. So they were reinterpreting, so to say. Thanks. Yeah, good. They were reinterpreting these models as benchmarks to determine whether a particular investment, a mutual fund, had been doing well or not with respect to the risks that they had been taking. These measures of investment performance were used at hearings by the Security Exchange Commission to introduce regulation on fees charged by asset managers. So again, these models were used as benchmarks to evaluate and to establish and write regulation for whether mutual funds should charge the fees that they were charging for managing assets. And there was a report written in 1968 by Chicago scholars for the Bank Administration Institute, basically to invite or to convince bankers that the adequate assessment of investment performance of pension funds had to be done according to the capital asset pricing model, or at least that performance or expected returns had to be assessed with respect to the risks that they were taking. Okay, so this is the idea that financial economists were doing this kind of interaction and implications much earlier, and that this was also part of the theory development. This is more or less the idea that I want to convey here. Okay, so computerization as a factor in the shift in economics, it's undeniable the role, many methods, the simplex method, numerical method. The idea is that development of technology facilitated the development of new sources of data as well as larger data sets. This is something that was happening in economics in general. How did that cash out in financial economics? I would say that computerization and its limits as well actually shaped the field. And again, I am bringing up here the creation of CRISP, which is on were this not for these data sets, there would be no proper analysis of the theories that were developed. And indeed made possible that scholars and practitioners interested in stock prices could store them and analyze them with the purpose of finding patterns to predict stock prices. So the fact that there were computers actually made people think or convinced that they could take an approach to asset pricing in a quantitative way, which was very controversial at the time in the financial industry because it was a matter of expertise at the time, where there would be a number of experts and they might be looking at charts or they might be looking at fundamentals, but there was no quantitative, objective, let's say, approach to analyzing stock prices. And the importance of non-academic institutions. So Backhouse and Cherrier, they discuss how this has been important for economics, or how this could have been the cause of this empirical turn. The fact that now we have institutions like the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, where there's research being done outside academic institutions. And they mentioned the transformation of the think tank landscape, the rise of advocacy think tanks, and proliferation of specialized journals. So this is how they think, okay, this might have caused the move towards the empirical turn. For finance, I would like to say that this is something, again, that has shaped the field in numerous ways. So I mentioned already that Merrill Lynch was fundamental in the creation of CRISP. They basically partner with the University of Chicago. This is a project they funded with an initial $50,000 that was supposed to last for 6 months, and in the end lasted 3.5 years with an investment of $200,000. Wells Fargo, which is one of the oldest banks in the United States, initiated a management science division with the purpose of developing quantitative methods for money management. So this is also when an external institution starts a research division to try to basically come ahead of their competitors to offer better alternatives of money management. And they bring in basically the whole, through a person called John McGone, they basically bring in the entire Chicago faculty to work basically for them in consulting, with consulting fees. And in fact, Wells Fargo afterwards funded several conferences in which papers were discussed and so forth. From this division came the idea of index funds, and Arthur D. Little, a consultancy on operations research, brought its research in close contact with academia to the asset management industry as well. So here we have again another institution that played a very important role in managing or shaping the financial industry. I don't think I have, unfortunately, how much? 5 minutes? Yeah, okay, never mind, I'll skip this one, which was kind of a nice story, but anyway. So, okay, so the wrap up. What I've been trying to say so far is that financial economics seems to have some analogies with economics with respect to the way in which it has developed, and particularly its approach or its move towards becoming more empirical. The analogy, perhaps the best one or the closest one, is that this has been funded in an important theoretical core. The CAPM is the typical neoclassical framework, and this was considered in the profession or the field as basically what was lending rigor to financial economics. But there are also these analogies that I think are interesting. So there is no apparent hierarchy between theory and the empirical application. Instead, there is a back and forth between theory and empirical applications that has kind of nurtured the theory and changed it theory shaped empirical applications and tests, and the other way around. And in particular also non-academic institutions as well as computerization did not change the style but actually shape the discipline. Okay, so this is what I just said. To conclude, I would like to say, okay, if this analysis is correct, what can we learn from this, or why should we care about this comparison or this contrast? I think that the insight about finance and finance research is helpful to understand the idiosyncrasies of the field. So this might call for a less encompassing statements about the state of economics as a whole, and more to drive us to do more field-specific assessments of where our discipline is going. I just wrote that up after Alan's talk. I think that as a follow-up to my question to Alan, a description of the evolution and the efforts of financial economists to understand the determinants of asset pricing may allow us to make a balanced assessment of the merits and faults of the current framework. So looking at this history and trying to understand what these people were trying to do in their context and how their research was being shaped by the tests that they were doing on their models might allow us to make balanced assessment. Okay, did they get this right? Why is Merrill Lynch or our non-academic organizations involved? Does it make a difference in the theories that are being shaped? That kind of questions I think are important. And well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, of course. So if it turns out that financial economics can claim to have empirical success, which I haven't argued for yet, right, or I'm not going to do. I mean, you might complain and say, well, you know, asset pricing, nobody knows what is going on with cryptocurrencies, how to price them. So that is, of course, an issue that we might discuss. But for the fact that it has been developed in check somehow with empirical reality, we may be facing what I want to call a successful model of scientific development. And here I would like to maybe stress this back and forth and somehow the recognition that, okay, we have tested and it didn't work and so forth. And so I think this is important for an assessment of the field. That's it. Thank you.
We've got 9 minutes for questions. I'll take Alan. There are quite a few questions, so we're going to limit the time people speak. Four or five others.
Right. I'll try to be quick. Melissa, you said at the beginning I would hate what you did, and then you said you wanted to respond in your conclusion. Let me give you a different story very quickly, and then we can say which story is right. In 1900, Bachelier developed his theory of the random walk, okay? And his thesis referee was Henri Poincaré. Poincaré says, this will never work. It's great mathematics, but it has nothing to do with empirical reality, because you base your assumption on the fact that people act on their own information. And he said, in reality, people don't. They look at other people, they follow them like sheep. Okay? So he said, this is not going to have any empirical success. And Bachelier had a lousy career until the 60s, when he was pretty much dead, when suddenly Farmer and Company brought in all the theory you've mentioned. And that theory has been criticized all the time as being theoretically incorrect. And finally, with the award to Bob Shiller, who said the efficient markets hypothesis is incorrect, was given. At the same time as it was given to Farmer, who said the efficient markets is correct. So you have two different theories, one which turned out to be correct, more or less, and the other which turned out not to be correct, and the one that was successful was the not correct. So I find that a very complicated story to insert into financial economics was a success. So how do you respond to that?
Well, thank you. Yes, I am aware of that. I would say, so I think this is related to what I said before in this being, I mean, I think successful doesn't necessarily mean that it's perfect or that it will be able to explain everything that we would like it to explain. But I find fascinating that a very simple model like the CAPM was able to capture certain things in stock markets. So it is, you could say, if the proof in the pudding is in the eating, right? You might be able to say, well, you know, for certain periods it worked, under certain conditions it works, and actually if I confront my model with my data, there are certain things that the model does capture. Yes, the model has also been proven to be inaccurate for, or at least doesn't not predict well certain classes of assets. But I think it's, if we agree, or at least if we are willing to accept that our theories, especially in the social sciences, are very unlikely to be perfect, then this might be already a good try, unless we come with something better, of course. That would be my answer.
You should say Black-Scholes rather than CAPM, because Black-Scholes is the thing that is the key. Sorry.
Probably there are about 4 or 5 hands. Could we have right at the back, please? Yes, yes.
Thank you for a really fascinating talk. I just wondered if you could make a comment on the relationship between financial economics and the real world.
Mm-hmm.
Given that the rise of financial economics, the expansion of finance and financialization are, to quite a lot of the literature, causally responsible for a lot of the dysfunctions in the global economy.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that fit with your fascinating story?
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't think that I would dare to make an assessment of whether financialization it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think this is what I was trying to outline at the outset in thinking, okay, this is what these people have been trying to do. They have been trying to understand what determines asset prices. And to some extent, they have been successful in coming up with this very simple way of saying, okay, this captures something of the fluctuations in prices and explains the cross section and so forth. I think you could make a case for good things and bad things. The fact that now lots of people have access to financial markets might be a good thing. If you cannot afford to buy a house, maybe your chances are that you can train yourself and learn a little bit and invest in the stock market. That was possible now thanks to index funds, and you could say they have been democratized to some extent. On the other hand, you can say, well, the fact that index funds, the agglomeration and ownership of corporate America and corporate world, is that a good thing? Probably not. But this is, I think, the kind of questions that we need to make, right, in order to be able to assess the goodness or the badness. I don't know if that is satisfactory, but yeah.
Franklin?
Yeah, just to elaborate just a little bit on your talk, your mention of index funds. I mean, that is a clear example of where the efficient markets hypothesis has shown, it implies that fund managers on average are not going to be able to beat their benchmarks.
Yeah.
And that is actually, the empirical work there has definitely shown
Yeah.
that active fund managers, very few of them actually beat their benchmarks. And this will have a very important practical outcome, because it means that those overinflated fees that fund managers were
Yeah.
charging, there's been a whole shift. So there's this practical outcome. There's been a big shift, especially in the United States, towards passive index tracking investing at much lower cost. So that's a clear example of how research in that area has, in fact, had big benefits in terms of in financial markets for investors and so on.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I have a paper exactly about that. So, I mean, I don't want to be too committed about the benefits of index funds, because I think it also has problems, right, what I just said. But yeah, I mean, this is a consequence of this theory. And I think it's something that I would like to say that more than say that it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's something that we need to be able to account for to make an assessment of this field. I think that's really the point that I'm trying to make. Yeah. Thank you.
I saw your hand first.
Andreas Reiter. I have a suggestion that might immunize you against the criticism. Just rearrange the title. Instead of saying what makes asset pricing empirically successful, you would say what makes empirical research on asset prices successful.
Yes, thank you.
Because I think that's what you answered.
Yes,
And the other thing is subject to further exploration.
absolutely. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for that.
Yes.
Just a short comment on that. Indeed, this is the point. So what you're actually looking, you suggested the hierarchy of theory and empirics, and I'm a bit sort of puzzled about this, because what you're not looking, also Backhouse and what's her name?
Sherry.
Don't look at is the fact that, you know, when a theory is established and makes its paradigmatic core self-evident, most of the research that will follow will be empirical to validate and confirm it. So it's not as if you have a situation in which the theory is competing with the empirics. It's actually quite the contrary. It's evidence to the power of the theory.
Yeah.
And what we have more recently is the fact that some people who are going to the classroom and teach general equilibrium are afraid to write about it or can't write about it, so they do experiments. So that's the ad hoc kind of publication you get. But in terms of finance in particular, I think what is missing in your story is the big debates about finance in the 50s and the 60s on whether it was applied economics or a different discipline. Is it a question about arbitrage, or is it a question really about applying expected utility, which is what CAPM is really?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say.
Oh, but then,
Yes,
okay.
you,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
Yes, about
There'll be injury time, so this is the last question.
yes, about the influence of theory on markets, just the other way around. Particularly in an efficient market hypothesis or CAPM, you never mention the performativity literature, which is huge on
Yes.
that field. I don't know if it's for further research or further paper, but I was surprised not to hear at least once mention this element, which is pretty big in financial institutions in the United States.
Indeed. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Must bring the session to an end, and we move to the next speaker.
Thank you.
We move directly to our next speaker, Dr. Nobantu Mbeki, from the University of Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg, and she's going to speak on is oligopoly a general case. She's going to speak for half an hour, so I'm going to give her 10 minutes
But is this the
speaking,
same
then
computer?
10 minutes, I'll give you a sign, 10 minutes to speak, and then we have 10 minutes questions, if that's what you like.
Hi, I stand before you today somewhat nervous because I've heard a mounting list of words that we cannot say during the course of this morning. Theory. And having gone after Professor Kerman in particular, I think what was most compelling was that you convinced me as well that there are problems with theories and there are problems with theory projects. So it left me somewhat at a loss as to what I was going to say. But I do have an account of learning and a theory of learning as an economist, and that one says, whatever you do, don't go after Professor Kerman. Yeah. So my talk today is part of a larger project in the theory of the firm. So we developed our own theory of the firm and then started to ask questions about like that you would apply with any standard theory of the firm, and to see how far we get, and to see that if we find anything different in one respect, but then also if we find anything that wasn't there before. And so up front, it's a Calexian theory of the firm. And I'll come to what it means to be a Calexian theory of the firm. And we've turned from a theory of the firm and now applying it to actually if there is such a thing as a spectrum of competition. And it's well, not a rejection yet, it's a question as to whether there is any such thing as perfect competition. Now, Calexians begin from the premise that oligopoly is widespread, and that once oligopoly obtains, there's no reversion to perfect competition. And there's a tendency for industrial concentration to rise, and consequently, there's also a tendency for excess capacity to rise, which means there's stagnation in the long run. So you don't get any of these arguments that perfect competition give you. You don't get smaller size firms. You don't get increased entry. Even if you have entry, you still observe large firms. You still observe industrial concentration moving in a particular direction. So any analysis of pricing behavior any analysis of firm behavior begins with prices. And in a Calexian determination, there are actually two separate pricing systems. So there's a set of prices which would be set as marginalist prices are normally, standard marginalist prices, and those are what are called demand-determined prices. And the reason that these become less interesting is because demand-determined prices are driven by the business cycle. They're not driven by any particular actions of any firms. So what are interesting prices are how prices are set in every other industry than primary industries. And that's cost-plus prices, or cost-determined prices, which imply there's loose or imprecise perfect maximization. So it's a cost-plus price that's set on short-run costs. And these short-run costs are horizontal because firms operate at below full capacity. It means that firms add a markup to those short-run costs, and that markup is determined it's for profit, and it's determined by the financing requisites of the firm. Now, in such an environment, you have firms that are able to autonomously raise funds for themselves to do with as they see fit. So it's not just a question of firms having to go to markets to pursue and to fulfill particular aims. But we do still have, because it's oligopolistic, it's constraints imposed by interdependence. The idea that any firm changes what happens in the market, and what happens, any single firm can change what happens in the market. So consequently, because costs are short-run, because short-run costs are horizontal, prices are then horizontal on top of those. Supply curves are actually horizontal at below full capacity. Now, infinitely elastic supply is a feature of technology, but then also strategic reasons. Technologically, the indivisibilities of large scale just mean that firms always have excess capacity. But strategically, firms carry excess capacity to respond to unforeseen events. So if there's a change in demand, they have excess capacity and they're able to respond to that. And they're able to adjust excess capacity to respond to that. But then firms also carry excess capacity for strategic reasons. So if to deter entry is a reason that a firm would want to carry excess capacity, or firms in an industry would carry excess capacity. Now, so we're saying the representative firm, that word again, a representative firm is an oligopolistic one, meaning that interdependence of large firms that do not outrightly maximize profits, and that's simply to say that firms can go for long periods of time without maximizing profits, is a necessary and sufficient condition for the existence of a Calexian system. So, well, if prices don't maximize profits, what is it that prices actually do? So, well, they don't clear markets, and they're not intended to. they're administered to the market rather than administered to firms. So they're firm determined and not market determined. So these prices are long-term strategic prices. These prices are prices that reflect the strategic objectives of the firms themselves rather than reflecting market conditions. And also the allocative function of prices is actually a byproduct of the other roles that prices play, which is anything other than information. They are non-informational because they're sticky and they don't change necessarily in response to changes in market conditions. They only change when costs change. So, but prices, on the other hand, are telling us that there is a link between profitability and expansion, and that link is inseparable because it's mediated by those very prices. So what we're left with, so for Calexians, there are two types of prices then. Having eliminated demand-determined prices, there are two types of cost-plus prices. Profit-based or investment-based. And profit-based prices are Calexian proper, which are firms set as high a price as possible to generate as much profit as possible to be able to fund investment. Investment-based prices are actually Agnerian prices. They're a derivative, but it says that firms actually set a growth rate, and then they set a price that converges on that growth rate and makes it possible. So it provides the funding necessary to make that growth rate possible. So what you can see is scarcity and time constraints are not features of post-Keynesian analysis. So instead what you have, so if we were to talk about competition, instead what you have is a relationship between profit margins, excess capacity, investment, and industrial concentration. So, just if I say that. The ability to charge high prices leads to high profit margins. Those profit margins are used to fund investment, and in funding investment, you generate excess capacity and retain excess capacity, and in industrial concentration increasing, it also causes excess capacity. So this is telling you that this has clear stagnation. It's a non-reversal of conditions that lead you towards stagnation. So, but what is it? But why? Why would a firm want excess capacity, especially if it knows it's going to stall its own program in the long run? And our argument is it's to do with uncertainty. And firms, it's the process by which firms mitigate uncertainty is what leads to stagnation over and over again, even with new cohorts of firms, and even if firms are heterogeneous in a sense, yeah. So to come to our theory, we had two problems. We had a set of retrospective problems, and we had a set of prospective problems. In terms of retrospective problems, as you've seen, we're faced with two types of pricing, which are actually giving us two quite different views of the firm. So if there are two theories of the firm, at least on the basis of having two types of prices. One emphasizes short run, the other one emphasizes long run. One emphasizes profit maximization, the other one emphasizes growth maximization. So ultimately you have two theories, and what is most important of them is actually they are situated in two fundamentally different environments. Growth maximizing firms are themselves a stabilizing feature of a stable capitalist mode of production. But if you take up the profit maximizing strain, you don't have that stability. Firms are faced with an incredible amount of instability to which they respond and impose stability on their environments. Now, we come to the reason prospectively, well, why didn't we go with growth maximization? Because growth maximization at least has the benefit of at least showing long-run objectives, and we're talking about in different ways about how the firm's objectives are actually long-run. But growth maximization for us became a problem because it was only restricted to large firms, and yet we know that there are different sized firms in industries. The unit of analysis problem, again, was the view on uncertainty was only as a macroeconomic concept, and no space was made for any other form of uncertainty. the problem of time, that uncertainty was also exclusively a long-run property, which is also not the case, because we know different size units make different size decisions of different size ranges, which are all uncertain. And the fourth was it lacks empirical validation. But what is interesting about Kalecki's work, though, is for Kalecki, there is no long run. So for him, there's no long run that's independent of the short runs that comprise it. So when we speak about a long run, what we're actually speaking about is something that's evolutionary. So we're saying one short run will morph into another short run, will morph into another short run. But it's a process that's ongoing. And the reason that this becomes so important for anything that then happens as Kaleckian is that because it's about path dependency and it's about hysteresis. So there's no presumption that the conditions under which things are done today are going to be the same conditions under which things are going to be done tomorrow, which makes, well, we'll see, which relates to the whole issue of stability. Now, our argument is that firms live in a fundamentally uncertain world, so they have to somehow find a way of, not a fundamentally unstable world, and they have to find a way of imposing stability on the world in which they inhabit. So you ask, well, what are all these, what is so uncertain? What is so uncertain about the world? Well, we know product market competition breaks out. We know entry occurs. We know, for example, that technology changes firms' innovation profiles, and then we also know that technology is also imposed on firms, even if they didn't want to change. So all of these things mean that firms live with a lot of instability, and our argument is that instability actually comes from only three sources. Either they're going to find instability coming from the product markets, to which oligopoly is a response. Interdependence, the one benefit of interdependence is the ability to cooperate in industry, and at the limit, the ability to collude. Factor market instability from technology and new technology, and particularly if you're forced to adopt technology not at a pace that is determined by yourself. And then there's credit market instability, and credit market instability is associated with two, moral hazard and collateralization. Moral hazard because in the separation of ownership and control, the people that are doing the borrowing are not the people that are doing the paying back. And collateralization because when a firm borrows, they have to put up their assets as collateral, and we don't know how investment is going to pan out, neither do they, and they risk losing those assets in the process. So what we're saying, so ultimately then it comes to the fore that, why is it that we see this ubiquitous stability? There are so many things that seek to derail the planning procedures of firms, but somehow we see that behavior is actually quite regular. And our argument is, well, it's regular because it's imposed. Somebody expended resources to keep things to do what work was done to produce the result that we see. And those resources, for us, come from distinguishing between what are dominant firms and what are every other oligopolistic firm. And dominant firms, we say, are predatory and seek to control their environment, whereas any other firm we'd call passive, even if it's large. Now, a dominant firm incurs, and would incur costs, like to actually prey on other firms. And those costs are actually what then tell us that, okay, dominance was sought because they're going to be higher for a subset of firms than for other firms. And because as they apply them, we know that these are just to maintain a position of dominance and to be able to maintain a position of autonomy as well, actually, from the decisions of other firms in the industry. Now, if that happens, all other firms in the industry become tethered to any one of these dominant sets or any one of these dominant firms. So you ask, well, how does it then happen that all this stability then comes about? Well, through informal networks, formal contracts, agreements, firms begin to interlock. And once they interlock, they begin to move in the same direction. So while you have this stabilizing movement that locks firms into these agreements and locks them into behavior that's cooperative and locks them into behavior that reproduces the kind of conditions that already exist, you already have this seed of instability again that it's going to tip them over, because those very same firms are all now moving in given or in particular directions without the flexibility to move. So a tentative theory. But so just to sum up, actually, was to ask, well, why would you still see small firms in the same industry if you have all of that going on and you have this tendency to concentration and this polarization? And our argument is you still see small firms because small firms have to do out of necessity what large firms don't have to do because they don't need to. And small firms, as a consequence, do all the experimenting in the market. And they create footpaths for large firms to follow. And hopefully, for them, the idea being that they won't fail or commit the same error. So this tells us a lot about behavior. But the one thing that I think is interesting about behavior is that it tells us that maybe we're wrong about what the motivation of firms is. Maybe it's not power, maybe it's not profit, maybe it's not growth, maybe it's stability. And all other things are a means to an end rather than an end in of themselves. And I think another one you may find interesting is, well, this all began because I queried whether there was a spectrum of competition, so from perfect competition at one end to monopoly of the other. And the whole argument is no. Once oligopoly obtains its stays, we haven't observed any perfectly competitive firms, but at the same token, we've observed monopolistically competitive firms. But maybe if there was a spectrum, it would lie on that side. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we have 10 minutes now for questions.
Small question. Just one small question. As two sort of comments there. One is you equate or you use concentration as a measure of competitiveness. And it really isn't. You can have a very highly concentrated industry which is extremely competitive, and you can have a very low concentrated industry which is not. So think just about, at the time, think of, Microsoft and Apple years ago. But the second thing is that you said something about evidence which, as far as I'm concerned, I know the opposite, that this is a Schumpeterian hypothesis about the investment. He talked about monopolists investing more in R&D. But the evidence, until recently, seemed to suggest that larger firms, not small firms, as you say, larger and in the highly concentrated industry are those that invest most in R&D. But you just said the opposite argument. So
No.
You said that the small firms are doing the business that the large firms
No,
don't
they're
want to
doing
do.
the experimenting.
Experimenting? What do you mean?
Yeah, so like suppose you change, I'll put it to you this way, which is really, prices went up, and then prices went up, and some firms, generalized inflation, right? Generalized prices went up, and then some firms raised prices, but other firms didn't change their price, but they changed the quantity that they give you. Which one of those is correct?
So I don't understand what you're asking.
Which one is going to lead to less destruction of demand? So if you have, so it's a thought experiment. If you have a generalized increase in prices, so everybody has to raise prices. So one set of firms goes ahead and raises those prices, but the other set of firms achieve the same end by actually like giving you less for the same amount of money. Yeah, so it's that kind of thing that I'm talking about. I don't think that new little firms are creating technologies that big firms take out. I think they experiment with processes and they experiment, but R&D, I mean, this is empirically, R&D is done by big firms and it's paid for by the firms themselves. So I suppose if we were to tell the story differently, what we're calling growth, what we're calling investment, what we're calling is the end of a spectrum.
Lady right at the back. Sorry, yes, you?
Thank you. So that interlocking and co-evolving, is that collaborative? I've got two questions. So is that collaborative, or is there sort of something competitive in that? My first question.
Okay, so if you were asking where would we see, well, it's a common solution. It's a common solution to a common problem. So if you're saying, well, who competes with whom? Well, I'd say dominant firms compete with each other. Firms, like oligopolistic firms, compete with each other, but they find ways around this competition so that it's not destabilizing. So it's not necessarily, I mean, there's nothing that says it wouldn't be two firms of equal size, but by the same token, it could just be one large firm and it could be 10 little firms. But they find where they confront each other in markets, they find ways of minimizing that friction.
And then my second question, just quickly, is, this seems to have some implications for, so I guess the question is, when you say in the sector, do you mean across the whole value chain? Because a theory like this, if applied to something, say, like circular economy, could...
I haven't thought of it that way yet. Like, I mean, absolutely, you're absolutely right, but I haven't thought of it that way yet, yeah. Yeah.
Alan, you had your...
Yeah, one thing
quick question.
that you didn't mention, I think, was mergers and takeovers. And one explanation for increased concentration is that some firms take over other firms. John Reed once said, who was the CEO of Citicorp, said, when asked, what do you think of competition? He said, if somebody is successful, we buy them. And that was his vision of competition, but that leads to concentration.
Thank you.
Yes.
I found it very interesting, your talk, but I was trying to think about it in terms of my business, which is a startup business. And in some sense, what we have in our industry, if you want to call it that yet, is a large number of small firms, but we are not anything like perfect competition, which you would, economists say, large number of small firms, that's perfect competition. But then again, we're not like a few firms, dominant firms, nobody's dominant yet. And, it's much more like a Schumpeterian, survival of the fittest type of mechanism for us. And I was wondering if you had any comments on how that sort of dynamic fits in here. But that's just sort of eventually this new area will sort of consolidate into some sort of oligopolist model, or that sort of how that fits into your thinking.
Well, it's true. So one is to say, you're absolutely right, but there is a model of behavior, and there is a model of the type of industry that you're in. So monopolistic competition would actually look like that, because what's proprietary to every firm is its information, isn't it? And it's non-replicable in a sense. So, and then would there be? Well, look at Facebook, look at Google, look at you know what I mean. The argument you're asking, does any sort? So if there are small firms, do they tend to become larger firms? Or does every type of competition tend towards oligopoly? And I want to tentatively say yes, and the reason it's tentatively is we haven't looked at enough to know. Yeah.
One last question. Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to sort of put this also in a sort of international trade context, because although an industry may be oligopolistic domestically, in the context of international trade, it's essentially a global market. So you've always got competitive pressure from imports, unless you can lobby the government to impose quotas or tariffs or whatever, which is a possibility that you might want to explore as well. The other thing is, and that's related also to the idea that in the international trade context, the pricing power is more to do with product differentiation and monopolistic competition rather than oligopoly.
Sorry.
So I don't know, is that another thing possibly you could explore there?
I think where there is some overlap, no, definitely, thanks, and you're absolutely right about that, but I think where there is some overlap or like some similarity in the case is that firms run away from price competition, but they do a lot of competition in quantities. And I think like your point that you're making is exactly that, and it's absolutely valid. It's something that we need to look at, because if we were to say anything empirical, we'd be able to say which types of goods, which types of prices as a consequence.
going to bring the session to an end. I've been informed that tea time was going to be half an hour. It's now been cut to 15 minutes. The time now on my watch is just on 4:45. So we'll start here again at 4 o'clock for the last session. So please, let's start at 4 o'clock sharp.